Good evening, everyone. This is Terry Smith from the Pollinator Posse, and my co-founder, Tora Rocha, is here with us tonight, too. We're here to talk to you about pollinators, both what's going on with them and what you can do as gardeners and citizens to help out. So I'm going to just go ahead and get started. So as I said, my name is Terry Smith, co-founder of the Pollinator Posse, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute. I'm also the president for Community of Lake Mena, which is a support friends group for the Rotary Nature Center at the lake in Oakland. I am the co-founder of Piedmont Connect, which is a sustainability organization. By profession, I'm a STEAM education specialist, science, technology, engineering, art, and math, and curriculum developer. I was a science teacher for a number of years. I'm a naturalist, artist, and gardener. And also with us tonight is Tora Rocha, who's the co-founder of the Posse. Tora worked as a park supervisor for the city of Oakland for many years. She was responsible for the grounds around Lake Merritt, the gardens at Lake Merritt, the Rose Garden, if you're familiar. She still heads up Friends of the Gardens at Lake Merritt, which manages the volunteer groups and the work that's done in the gardens. Founder of the Autumn Lights Festival, which if you've never been to this event, you should come this October. We think it'll be in real life in the gardens at Lake Merritt. It's a fabulous event with over 180 artists doing light installations in the gardens at night. She was the Jefferson Award winner for her work with the Pollinator Posse, in particular her signature event, which is called Teas for Bees, where kids hit seed balls with pollinator plants into the rough at golf courses with golf clubs. And she's our landscaping guru. I'm more the science and education side of things, and she is the plant expert and landscape expert. So the Posse, we are a loosely organized group of volunteers. Tora and I head it up, but there are many other people involved. Our focus is on learning, education, observation, reporting out to people, protecting, planting habitat, and collaborating with other groups. We're also part of Western Monarch Advocates as a subgroup in covering Northern California. And we've just become a partner with Monarch Joint Venture, which is a national group focused on monarchs. So the best way to reach us or get follow-up information from this presentation is to go to our webpage. I do apologize, our webpage is quite outdated. We know that. We're in the process of rebuilding it. But in the meantime, there are some good resources there. It's just they might be a little tricky to find. Our links don't look like links, and somebody looked at our webpage technically the other day and laughed at us. So we have a new one in the works, but in the meantime, if you go to the webpage, this is the resources page, which would be this tab. If you go into this link, Pollinator Posse Resources, a lot of the things I make reference to tonight, there's more detail there. Rearing guidelines, information about different kinds of milkweed, that kind of thing. We also have Tora's amazing color-coded plant list, which you're going to see tonight, and our citizen science project, where we're gathering data on monarchs, both the results from 2020, and if you become a participant for 2021, this is where you do that. The other things I want to point out is this contact button over here on the side. Two things you can do there. One, you can sign up for our email list. We don't spam you. We only send things out very limited, but that's where you can get on the list so you can hear about things we have going on. And also that's where you can send us messages. Those come directly to me and Tora. So if you fill out the contact form, it becomes an email to one of us. The other thing I will point out is the donate spot. If you enjoy this presentation and want to donate to us, that would be really great. Nobody's paid in this group. All the money goes into education or habitat development. So we appreciate any donation, however how small. And we have left into the future. We now have a button on there so you can pay by credit card. We were limited to checks until recently. So big step forward for us. We also have a very active Facebook group with over 1,200 members, mostly in Northern California, but some from other areas as well. A lot of conversation goes on there. That's where we've carried on most of our outreach over the last few years. But we know there are problems with Facebook, and a lot of people don't want to use Facebook, and certainly young people don't want to use Facebook. And so we're going to be relying more on our email list as well. We will be adding an Instagram account. There's only so much time. So why do we focus on pollinators? Well, pollinators are critical. You have to take a step back to plants, and we're both plant people initially. And when we think about plants, plants are really essential. When I work with kids, we talk about how plants are the base. Plants provide all the food on earth. If you're eating something other than water and salt, kids always figure those out. You're either eating a plant or you're eating something that ate a plant. And that's true of everything, all life on earth. So we're completely reliant on them. They also provide medicine, clothing, dyes, fuel, shelter. They balance our environment and provide habitat for us and other creatures. So in a way, that's really our focus. Pollinators help plants, and we help pollinators. So as I mentioned, plants need pollinators to reproduce. And there are a wide variety of pollinators. We focus particularly on bees and butterflies and hummingbirds to some extent. But the good news is the kinds of things we recommend for those pollinators benefit any of them. And so when we focus in on a particular type of pollinator or a species, the message is always broader. What we're doing will support pollinators and the ecosystem and all of us. I always start with honeybees because that's the first thing people have heard about honeybees being in trouble. And they're struggling. We don't focus a lot on honeybees in our work because they're not a native species. They're domesticated. They were brought in by the Europeans originally when they came to North America. And they're managed by human beings by and large. And it's not that we're not concerned about them, but they have a pretty hefty lobby with beekeepers and commercial beekeepers. And the things we talk about are equally effective for honeybees, and we have a concern about them, but we don't spend a lot of time on it. However, I will show you what's going on with them. As you know, they have a number of problems, and my husband, a beekeeper, could go into enormous detail about them. But in any case, what's happening is generally each year, beekeepers lose about half their hives to one thing or another. And that's what this graph shows. It's this, the gold orangey color is the loss of hives, which is running between 40 and 50% per year. And I can attest to that. My husband, with his urban beekeeping, generally loses about half of his hives every year. Sometimes he knows why, sometimes he doesn't exactly know. They're stressed. There are a lot of things they're putting up with that all the insects and pollinators are putting up with, climate change and pesticide use and things like that. So those all come into play with honeybees. Our focus is a little bit more toward the native bees because most people aren't even aware of them. Tora often speaks to landscaping professionals. We talk to gardeners all the time, and we say native bees, and they have no idea what we're talking about. There are actually over 1,600 species just in California alone, and many more in the US and worldwide. Very varied species. You can see here just a sampling of how different they are. Very different in their behavior from each other and very different from honeybees. They don't sting, by and large. A few bumblebees do. but it's not common. They don't have hives. Most of them are solitary dwelling. Some of the bumblebees live in small colonies, small family-sized colonies, whereas your honeybees are living in colonies of tens of thousands at the peak in the summer. And they don't make honey. They're usually single mothers looking for a place to lay their eggs. They are solitary by and large. Female comes out at whatever time the plant, they're more heavily linked to particular plants. So if they're linked to fruit trees, or if they're linked to tomatoes, or if they're linked to some particular native plant nearby, they're going to come out from being larvae at the time of year that plant is blooming. Generally, their season is shorter. And that single mother, her job is going to be to lay eggs, to develop. And then after she's finished laying all her eggs, she goes on to her next life. And those pupa develop and come out the next year at the season of whatever plant they're tied to. So climate change is having a big effect on them because their timing and the timing of the plants is sometimes getting out of sync. The female lays those eggs one of two ways. They're either ground nesters, which means they burrow a tunnel into the soil, or they are cavity nesters that go into holes in wood, or like hollow reeds, hollow stems of plants, place nooks and crannies like that where they can lay their eggs and have them be safe. As gardeners, we don't help them out. That bare dirt, if you think about a little bee digging a hole, they need loose, soft ground that isn't covered with mulch or weed cloth. And we tend, particularly here in California, to cover everything with at least mulch. So leaving an area in your garden that has some loose soil that they can burrow into is really critical for them. Or not cleaning up all the dead wood and stems around your property, which we also do. We're very neat as gardeners, and that doesn't serve the ecosystem very well. Nature is messy, and we need to start thinking that way as well. The native bees are excellent pollinators. They're better pollinators than honeybees because they're not collecting all the pollen and nectar to take back to the nest. They kind of flop into the flower, they get covered in pollen. They keep some of it for their young, but they're not building that huge colony that honeybees are, so that pollen is left to be transferred to other flowers. So just to give you an idea of the range, you can see these two here, and thanks to Emil for these pictures. On the left, we have a little tiny sweat bee, and on the right, we have a carpenter bee, and these pictures are to the same scale. There is actually this much difference in size. And then there's a whole range of bees in between. So I wanted to just point out a few of them. As I mentioned, they're all very different, and they're much more tied to particular kinds of plants than honeybees are. So up in the left-hand corner, we have the squash bee. The squash bee is specialized to pollinate squash flowers, which honeybees, the pollen in the squash flowers is really sticky and heavy, and the honeybees don't like it. So they generally will not visit squash flowers. And so they're not good pollinators for that at all. The squash bees, however, are totally specialized to it. And in fact, the male bees sleep inside the squash flower so that when it opens in the morning and the females come to gather nectar and pollen, they're waiting to mate. So they're totally adapted. And I've been hearing lots of stories on gardening blogs lately about people talking about their squash, their pumpkins, or their zucchini growing to 2 or 3 inches and then just shriveling up and falling off the plant. And there's all this talk about it being possibly caused by disease. It's not disease often. It's that the squash blossom wasn't adequately pollinated. So there's not enough seeds in that fruit. So the plant aborts it because it's not going to produce seeds, which is its point in putting energy into the fruit. So a lot of people are, talking about how to hand pollinate these as humans, but we're way better off having the squash bees do it. I've tried it. They do a better job than I do. So then the bumblebee on the right I'm showing is on a tomato flower. Tomato flowers generally require what's called buzz pollination. And that means the flower doesn't release the pollen unless it's vibrated at a certain frequency, which the bee knows. And I've watched this happen in my own garden. The bumblebee goes up and kind of hangs underneath the flower, and you hear the buzz go up in frequency. And then all of a sudden it reaches that magic number, and poof, the pollen is released all over the bumblebee. And then it goes on and brushes against the next flower. It's pretty amazing to see. So if we want squash and tomatoes, we need to keep these guys around. There's another kind of bee, the mason bee, which are super effective at fruit tree pollination. So they all have a critical role in the ecosystem. And for us, just to show you down here at the bottom left, we have one of these single moms coming out of the hole in the ground where she has laid her eggs. And to the right, we have another native bee, which uses small cavities. And what they're doing in there is they lay an egg. And if it's a leafcutter bee, they wrap that egg and some pollen, a little package of food, all up in some leaves they've cut. Or sometimes they use mud, and then they seal off the chamber. And then they lay the next one and seal off the chamber till they have a little parade of eggs that they've left behind in the tube or in the tunnel. And then in the spring, or whenever the plant that they're attached to is blooming, those eggs are mature and they work their way out and go on with the life cycle. Excuse me. So while bees are going missing in action, the bright yellow on this map is the areas where they're very, very low in abundance. And you can see that pretty much corresponds to all our agricultural areas. You see the Central Valley in California, you see the prairies through the Midwest. So this is of great concern. Their habitat loss and insecticide use is really affecting them, we believe. So this is an area in China where they've actually eliminated all bees, we believe, due to pesticide use. And so they actually have humans going out and pollinating the fruit trees in the spring. Not a job I'd want. I don't think many people would want. And also it turns out humans aren't very good at this. The bees do a much, much better job. I've also heard talk about trying to create robotic bees. I mean, okay, I'm not going to say any more about that. So another favorite pollinator of ours are butterflies. In all truth, butterflies are not the very best pollinators. The native bees are actually better, but they're beautiful and they add a whole another array to our world. We hear a lot about monarch butterflies, and I'm going to use them to talk more about the life cycle in a minute. So they used to be common here, not as common as they were. We'll talk about that. Cabbage whites, which are very common and fun to watch in the garden. The Anna swallowtail on the right, also very adapted now to fennel, which has gone wild. So they have a good host plant source. Bottom left, we have the Gulf Fritillary, which lives on the passion vine. Bottom right, we have the tiger swallowtail, which has its caterpillars in ash and sycamore trees. And then in the middle, this pipevine swallowtail, which is a favorite of mine. We actually have a project going in Oakland to bring this butterfly back, depending on where you are. It used to be used to be all through the area, Oakland, East Bay. Right now, it comes only as far south as Berkeley and out toward Antioch, and I've heard in Alamo they're there, but we're trying to bring it back into Oakland. And we have a project going to do that. So if you're interested in helping out with that, planting the plant it needs, you can let us know. I was out watching one laying eggs today on the plant in my yard. So far we've got some success going. So monarchs. Monarchs are our poster child. They're incredibly popular. They have the best PR of probably any insect. They have whole national organizations dedicated to them, Monarch Watch and Monarch Joint Venture, and there's a lot of attention on them. They are struggling, as all the pollinators are, but they're not, well, this year, maybe this may not be entirely true. I'll tell you more about that in a minute, but all pollinators are declining, all insects are declining. And in the study that Art Shapiro from Davis has been doing for the last 30 years, monarchs are declining, but they're kind of in the middle. About half the species are doing worse than they are, and about half are doing better. So they're a good representative sample. But when we talk about what to do for monarchs and what their struggles are, it's the same for all the butterflies. It's basically climate change, pesticide and herbicide use, and then loss of habitat. So I'm going to talk in more detail about the monarchs, but what I have to say about them applies to all the butterflies. So you can see there have been a lot of headlines about the monarchs lately. As I said, they have the best PR team going. So I know people are asking about them, and that's why I use them as the model. So there's that old blessing and a curse, may you live in interesting times. And I have to say, you may have come tonight hoping I would give you answers. I am not going to be able to give you answers, but I'm going to try not to give you too much in the area of opinions. I am going to try to go with evidence and observations of people we trust and who are doing the research. But some of it's speculation because we don't really know entirely what's going on. So what we do know insect life cycles. And this is true of all insects. They go through these stages. With a butterfly, its adult is the butterfly, which lays eggs, generally on a particular plant. The eggs then hatch, the caterpillars chew and eat and grow. That's their larva stage. And then that larva becomes a pupa. In the case of butterflies, it's called a chrysalis. If it's a moth, it's a cocoon. And and then out of that chrysalis or pupa state comes the adult, and the cycle continues. Call this metamorphosis. Well, caterpillars, not unique to them, but it's not common to all insects. Caterpillars are the ultimate picky eaters. Each butterfly species and moth species, there's only one food that the caterpillars of that species can eat. So if you don't have that food, that plant, then you're not going to have that butterfly. And that host plant is different for each species. So you hear a lot of talk about milkweed for monarchs. Well, that's fine for monarchs, but every species has its own host plant that it needs in order to survive. So we start out with an egg, which takes 4 to 8 days to hatch. The adult lays the egg on the host plant. So for monarchs, it's on milkweed. So that when the egg hatches, the caterpillar has the food source. They try to spread the eggs around. I just learned recently that monarchs can smell an egg on a leaf. So they're going to, if at all possible, not lay another egg in the same place to create competition for the caterpillars. And if there is another egg there, the first caterpillar that comes out, the first thing it does is go eat the other eggs. So it's a dog eat dog or caterpillar eat caterpillar world. This is just a close-up with an electron microscope of the incredible structure of the monarch egg. The details just amazing. So out of that egg comes the caterpillar. Caterpillar's total job is to eat, eat, eat. They grow, in the case of monarchs, they grow 2,000 times their original size. Imagine that. If you started out at 10 pounds, you'd be 20,000 pounds at the end of 2 to 4 weeks. So that's a human, if that, a human baby less than 10 pounds would end up at 20,000 pounds. It's amazing at the growth rate. Because they're growing so fast, their exoskeleton, or what we would refer to as the skin, cannot keep up. And so what happens 5 different times during that, and we call each of these stages instars, they build a new exoskeleton or skin inside, and then they kind of crawl out of the old skin like they're crawling out of a sleeping bag, turn around and eat it so they don't waste that resource or leave a trail, and then they go on growing. So as I mentioned, each species has a particular plant. With monarchs, it's milkweed. Milkweed and monarchs have co-evolved. So it's kind of a war of the worlds. The milkweed doesn't want the monarchs to eat all of it up, or any other creature to eat it all up. And the monarchs do want to eat. So the defense that the plant has come up with is this sticky latex sap, which you can see, which gives it its name, milkweed. And actually, that is not an advantage to the caterpillars. I just learned also that 1/3 of the caterpillars, when they take their first bite of the milkweed, it's too much latex, and it either glues their jaws shut or kind of glues them to the plant, or chokes them. So that's it, 1/3 of them gone right from the beginning. And the sap also contains toxic chemicals, cardiac glycosides, which are a heart-stopping poison, which, I have not tasted milkweed, but I have been told that it tastes so awful, you would be hard-pressed to eat enough to actually hurt yourself as a human. However, that sap is dangerous if you get it in your eyes. So you have to be really careful if you're manipulating milkweed plants and you get sap on your hands. You're going to be very careful not to get it into your eyes. So that toxin, the monarchs have adapted to, and they actually take it into their body as a protection. This is a famous Time Life series photographs done by Lincoln Brower in the early 60s, when this was being documented, of the barfing blue jay who decided to have a little snack on a monarch and greatly regretted it later, and likely will never do that again. So it does provide some protection for the monarch, and that's why they wear those orange warning colors, so creatures know that they're toxic. Now, the milkweed is helpful, at least for blue jays and some predators, but there's still plenty of other things out there that affect monarchs negatively. And in fact, there was documentation this year of these Mississippi kites in a botanic garden who didn't seem the least bit bothered by the toxins in the milkweeds and in the monarchs, and were munching away. There's also a parasitic protozoa called OE. It's unique to monarchs, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a minute. There's tachinid flies, which is a parasite which the adult fly pierces the caterpillar skin, lays the eggs inside, and then the larvae are developing inside the caterpillar and kind of eating it from the inside out. And either the caterpillar bursts open and a bunch of live pupa come out, or the chrysalis does. So that's a little gross when you see it. And a recent new predator are these European paper wasps, who've only come into California in the last 30 or 40 years. And they're not innately bad, but they don't have predation. They're not native here. And they are significant predators on caterpillars and eggs. I can go and see eggs one day and go back the next, and they're gone. And it's very often the paper wasps who've come and had a real lovely snack. I mean, caterpillars and eggs are just these wonderful fatty protein bombs for other creatures. There's also things that are just referred to as Black Death, which include bacterias and viruses. And there's another wasp that can parasitize, and something called MPV that are more generalized. So in general, only between 1.5% to 5% of eggs of monarchs in the wild make it to maturity. But that's significant contribution to the food chain and the ecosystem. That's the way it's been. So although we really want to protect them, we need to keep in mind that they have both roles in the ecosystem. So I wanted to talk a little bit about OE because it's a huge issue. So it's naturally occurring and only in monarchs. They've been coexisting with each other for a long time. It's transferred. An adult butterfly that's infected will have these little, you can see down in the bottom corner, these little tiny black dots. The other things are the butterfly scales from its belly. So these little black dots, they're like glitter. The butterfly lands on a plant, they fall off all over the plant, and then the butterfly flies off. It's either come to lay eggs or to nectar on a milkweed plant. And then a caterpillar comes along and consumes these. And depending upon how many it gets, the load, it may just have a mild infection, or it may be severely damaged and deformed. We used to liken it to the flu, that it definitely weakens the creature, and they don't get over it like the flu. But in some cases, it's really devastating. And you can see in the upper left-hand corner when you get these deformed butterflies, or butterflies that never make it out of the chrysalis, that have been affected. But even the ones that look fine can be carrying it and infect others, and also are weaker as a result because they're fighting the infection. So this is one of the concerns when people are rearing butterflies at home in cages and things, that it becomes a super spreader event. And it's one of the reasons that we really don't support large scale rearing or butterfly farms, because they become a real source of this. So in addition to all those enemies they come across, the milkweed plant is a whole ecosystem in and of itself. One of the things I get questions about all the time are these yellow aphids, these oleander aphids, which come and go. And you can see here, there's a monarch egg in amongst those aphids. So what I tell people about the aphids is you just need to learn to love them as part of the ecosystem. They don't have the PR that the monarchs do. We have this antipathy for aphids, but that, they're a part of the system. They actually don't damage the plant. They don't affect the eggs or the caterpillars. And anything you do to try to get rid of the aphids is equally going to damage eggs and caterpillars who might be there. So, and they come, the ladybugs come, the ladybug larvae come and eat them. And usually I find they come and go. If a plant gets really heavily infested, I might go out and just hand squish the sections where I see it. But they really are part of the system that we need to love. There's also milkweed bugs, which don't bother the monarchs themselves or the plant. They do tend to eat the seed pods, but since milkweed plants make a ton of seeds, unless you're growing it for seed, that's not an issue. There's this little red milkweed beetle. There's also tussock moths who feed on milkweed. And this is the larva of a lady beetle or ladybug about to eat an aphid. So they are our friends. So it's just a reminder that we as humans like to focus in on one species or one thing that we particularly like. But in fact, this is an ecosystem. It's worked for a long time before we showed up. And we need to be aware of that and be taking care of the whole thing. So milkweed, in addition to feeding the caterpillars of the monarch butterfly, is a feast for everybody else. As I mentioned, nectaring plants, a lot of the pollinators are going to use the same plants. So here you see 2 honeybees and a valley carpenter bee on a milkweed plant coming to get the nectar. And that's all great too. It's a great addition to your garden for a bunch of pollinators. A little bit about milkweed and the great milkweed controversy. You may have seen a lot of headlines about the right kind of milkweed, the wrong kind of milkweed, and so on. And literally at meetings, we've seen people come close to blows over this. I mean, the first thing I want to say is this is a little bit of a tempest in the teapot. The kind of milkweed you plant is not the big issue right now. It definitely, you should understand the differences and why there's concern about it. But compared to climate change and pesticide use and general habitat loss, this is a much smaller factor. I just want to get that clear first. So the issue is the native milkweeds, the California native milkweeds versus the other milkweeds. So these are the natives for this area of California around the Bay Area. Narrow leaf is this one, showy or speciosa. Californica, although it's very rare, you would be hard pressed to find this. This is one we're exploring because it comes up very early. And heartleaf or cordifolia. Those are the local natives. Now, there are some other natives to the US that are not foreign natives. We could get into that, but these are the ones that if you're planting something that's typical for your habitat, this is what you would plant. And you can't go wrong with planting any of these. The non-natives, most commonly that we're talking about are the tropical, the Curasavica, which has either orange and yellow flowers, or the silky gold version, which has just gold flowers. And also the Physocarpa, which is from South Africa. And the way you tell that, it's a much larger plant than the others, and it has these giant hairy seed balls. So hence the kind of crude name family jewels or balloon plant. And these open up and spread seeds like crazy. So that's one of our concerns about this being invasive. So those are the non-natives. So if you have yellow or red flowers, or you have the giant seed balls, then you have a non-native. So here's the issue. The benefit of the natives is that they co-evolved with our local ecosystem. Lots of the native bugs are adapted to them. And the key thing is that our local milkweeds go dormant in the winter. Unlike most California native plants, they go completely dormant. They stay dormant through the rainy season, and then they come up in the spring and they're active all summer. That means that those diseases like OE and various other viruses and things that can accumulate on the plant get cleared out every year. They get a clean slate. There's also concern, and there's a lot of debate about this, but one of the cues that pulls the monarchs out of diapause in the winter when they should be resting and keeping their resources to get through the winter is if there is milkweed nearby, it can trigger them to come out and become reproductive. Now, I will say you do not want to plant any milkweed near overwintering sites. And that's, Xerxes defines that as within 5 miles of the coast, the ocean coast, not the Bay coast. So here in the Bay Area, East Bay, we're fine. So it's not available as a food source or in winter or early spring. Except possibly the Californica, which comes up earlier. And there are some projects going to try to breed that. It's hard to germinate, apparently, so that we can have some earlier food sources as they come out of diapause earlier. And it just in general, when they test monarchs, they're healthier and stronger if they've been raised on the native milkweed. So you can't go wrong with planting pesticide-free native milkweed. And I do want to stress that pesticide-free. A lot of nurseries and wholesale nurseries are continuing to use neonicotinoid to treat pesticides to treat all their plants. That's a systemic pesticide based on nicotine, which goes into the tissues of the plant. It's there in the nectar, it's there in the leaves for the life of the plant, and it actually gets into the soil as well. Often nurseries don't even know because they're buying from a wholesaler. But one thing we can ask you to do as proactive consumers is to keep asking and ask the manager of the nursery, not just the guy who's loading the shelves, because we need to put the pressure on to get this out of the market. Europe has banned them. We're still allowing them to be used, and particularly on plants like this, where we're trying to feed particular creatures, putting toxins in the plant that affect them are not good. The other thing you might come across, this comes up a lot, is that the plant has been treated with a natural pesticide called BT. It's actually a bacteria that affects caterpillars. It will kill them. But the good news about BT is, first of all, it doesn't last very long. And it kind of washes and wears off the plant. A lot of our plants that we started with originally had BT on them, and they're fine now. Spraying them off really well with the hose, maybe covering them for a week or two to let it wear off before you open it up so that caterpillars can eat it. Annie's Annuals, who we love and we partner with a lot, is required to spray with BT because they ship out of state. And so it's if a nursery has to spray, it's the better choice as far as we're concerned. It's again, a natural biological control. It's a bacteria that affects caterpillars. But having treated plants in a second grade classroom once and having the kids watch the caterpillars die, it's not a pretty thing to see, and you need to be aware of it. But it's much preferable to the neonicotinoids. So native versus non-native, looking at the non-natives. So they're not native to our local ecosystem. So depending on how you feel about that, I know there are real purists about wanting all natives, and we're kind of in the middle, and people who really don't care. So you just have to take your own philosophical stand on that. They are active all year. They don't go dormant in the winter, which means that the disease and parasite load can really build up and make them a vector for those diseases. There's this issue of whether they cue the monarchs out of diapause in the fall and winter. Different research on that. But the good news is when we're having these monarchs coming out earlier in the spring, it is available for those monarchs to lay eggs on. So there's a lot of adjustment and debate going on about this right now. Monarchs eating tropical milkweed are shown to be a little bit weaker and have less flying ability. So for migration, it's not considered the best thing, but it's, again, it's not conclusive. What we have seen is there's no question that it increases the level of OE disease in the population, even when it's cut back frequently. I mean, typically in the past, we've said just cut it back in the fall. So it's like it's dormant in the winter, so it gets that fresh start. But now we're learning that even frequently cutting it back during the season, it's still adding to the OE, and the OE is really increasing in the monarch population. It can be invasive. The seeds spread, and then it goes into areas where it's not going to be tended by a gardener who's going to cut it back on a regular basis. So that's a concern. And it's highly available because it's pretty and bright. It's what the big box stores tend to sell, sometimes treated with pesticides, as I mentioned. So asking those questions is really, really important. So our recommendation at this point, and this may change as we learn more, is if you have it, cut it back frequently. It looks like it might be pretty useful in the spring, early spring, like this time of year when the monarchs are coming out and the native milkweed isn't yet up. But that may change. So I did want to just mention rearing briefly. I'm not going to go through all the pros and cons. By rearing, I mean bringing in caterpillars or eggs, raising them, and then releasing the adults. There are some pros and cons to it. And actually, technically in California, it's not legal by Fish and Wildlife, although we're working on that. So if you are rearing, please go to our website and read up on it so that you're not making things worse by doing it. I know it's all well-intended, and we hope that we're saving a few monarchs by doing it. Also, to be clear, indoor rearing or rearing in cages is not going to save the monarch population. If you want to do that, really lobbying for climate change and pesticide use and building habitat would be a much more effective use of your time. So I just wanted to show you these other butterflies, and you can see they're different host plants. Remember, milkweed is only the monarch's host plant. It's caterpillar plant, although it's a nectar source for lots of other critters. We've got fennel or angelica, which is the host for Anis swallowtails. Their native host is angelica or yampa, but they have adapted over to fennel, which was imported, but is very common, as you can see it along the roadsides. The painted lady has quite a few choices of what it can eat: mallows, thistles, legumes, and we're finding even more things. So it's a very adaptive butterfly. The Gulf Fritillary lives on any kind of passion vine. I actually have a fruiting passion vine that gives me a ton of fruit every year. And the fritillaries get the leaves, so it's really a win-win. So that's a lovely addition to your garden. Cabbage family, for the cabbage whites, any of the brassicas, and also nasturtiums. You see these guys everywhere. Buckeyes need plantain, cudweed, toadflax, things you're not likely to plant, but leaving a little area where they grow in your garden is really wonderful. We actually don't have the red admiral on this poster yet, but they live on nettle and pellitory. And although unless you're into herbal medicines, you're unlikely to be planting nettle, but pellitory is a common weed, and one that, if you leave a little area in your garden for that, you can get the red admirals and give them a place to live. And then there's the pipevine swallowtail, which we actually have a big project going in Oakland to try to bring this butterfly back. It used to live in the flatlands of Oakland. It hasn't for about 30 years because the plant was pretty much eradicated. So we have a project going to plant the plant and keep track of getting this butterfly back. And I actually was watching a butterfly laying eggs in my garden on my pipeline today. So it's happening. It's very exciting. We'd love to have you part of it. You can find more about that project on our website. So we have the caterpillars. They've eaten their host plant. They generally at that point crawl away from the host plant. They can go quite a distance, I've been surprised, and attach themselves to something sturdy. This one actually did attach itself to a monarch leaf or a milkweed leaf. Happens, not everybody's the same. And they're highly vulnerable during this time. They hook themselves to the leaf or branch or surface, and then they hang in this typical J shape for the monarch. Other caterpillars have other forms that they take. And I just wanted to show you that attachment they make. This is actually part of the caterpillar's body, and then it weaves this little silky mat, and it just Velcros itself to whatever the surface is. So they're in the chrysalis for 1 to 2 days. They actually liquefy inside there. Some small portions remain intact, the brainstem and a few other things. And in fact, they retain memory from the chrysalis stage to the adult stage, or from the caterpillar stage. So butterflies, moths make cocoons, which means they wrap themselves in a silk kind of bag around themselves. Butterflies make a chrysalis, and they actually make it inside their body. So the last time they molt their skin, what's inside is the chrysalis. So they hang there for a couple of days, and in a very short time, they split that skin, they wiggle around. It's actually a very active moment. The skin splits, they wiggle it all up to the top. And then this is the part I love. They actually detach themselves for a second, drop the skin, and hook back onto that Velcro pad. And sometimes they don't manage it and the skin's there and it's not a big deal, but I guess it's an aesthetic thing. They don't want that old skin anymore. And then the chrysalis gradually takes on the final form. And so you can see inside, this is a newly formed chrysalis. They look like this through most of the time. And then after about 10 days, depending on the temperatures, these winter chrysalids we've been getting this year, we've actually heard have gone as long as 75 days. But the norm is about 10 to 14. The couple days, day before they're going to emerge, you can see the wing color form. And this is what we see. And then when it's time to emerge, the chrysalis pops open. The butterfly slides itself out and hangs itself. You can see this curling proboscis. This is what they used to put into flowers to soak up nectar. Some people liken it to a straw. It's actually more like a sponge. It's not a tube, but that's how they soak up that nectar. That is actually wrapped around their head, split in half while they're inside the chrysalis. And as they're coming out, they zip the two parts together. It's actually wrapped around like what would be their ears. It looks like a Princess Leia hairdo, and then they pull that out and zip it together to be able to use it. And then you can see the wings are quite crumpled. The body is full of their equivalent of blood, hemoglyph, and they pump that out into the veins in the wings to basically inflate them. And then once they're completely inflated, they harden, and the butterfly is ready to go. So this whole process takes usually less than an hour. Now, to be clear, I think I mentioned this earlier, less than 5% of eggs in the wild make it to this adulthood stage. And that's fine. That's part of their role in the ecosystem, which is to feed all the various creatures that have are less popular with us humans. So they drink nectar. You can see that proboscis now zipped together. You can see even the seam where it went together. And they are now a flying and drinking insect, whereas they were a chewing, crawling insect before. So one of the things that's quite unique about monarchs is that they migrate, and they migrate back and forth. A few other butterflies migrate from here to there, but the monarch migration is quite magical. And there are two distinct populations of monarchs. There is some crossover in Arizona that used to be thought they were completely separate. They're not, but this is what catches people's attention. So the eastern population, this was only discovered in 1974 by American scientists, what was happening and where they were going. The indigenous people in Mexico, of course, knew earlier than that, but as a scientific discovery, it's not all that long ago. That the monarchs, they overwinter. They're basically a tropical butterfly, and there are places in the world where they just live in the tropics. But this group apparently adapted to flying north. They overwinter in the mountains of Mexico in the kind of, not too hot, not too cold, temperate zone. It's cool enough to keep them in diapause, which is a type of hibernation. They're not breeding or eating, and not so warm that they have to do those things. So it's a way to conserve their resources during the winter when the breeding situation is not as good for them. So then in the spring, when things warm up, they head north. They hit the milkweed in Texas. They begin laying eggs there. That generation then moves on and lays eggs further up. and another generation, and another generation, somewhere in the 3 to 4 to 5 generations during the course of the summer, move gradually north along with the milkweed and the nectar plants. And then that last generation, the furthest north, because of cues of time of day, the length of the day, and the change in temperature between night and day, they are, when they come out of the chrysalis, they're bigger, they're stronger, and they are already in sexual diapause. They're not breeding. And they are programmed to fly all the way back to Mexico. And along the way, they're nectaring and actually gaining weight, conserving their resources to get to a point where they can get through the winter. And that generation lives several months. A regular monarch butterfly is going to live 2 to 6 weeks, something like that. Whereas these guys can live actually up to 10 months. It's usually not that long, but that's possible because they're programmed differently. And then they're back there in the winter. So this is what it looks like in those overwintering sites. The trees are just hanging with all these monarchs. They do cluster together to conserve heat. And it's kind of an amazing sight. So that population, that eastern population, as you can see, there's a lot of fluctuation that's typical of monarchs, but the overall trend has been down. And 13, 14 was particularly bad. Now they're measured in acres. They don't try to count the individual butterfly, but where they are overwintering is measured in acres every winter. In 96, 97, the peak that we know about, it was at 45 acres. As of this year was a 26% drop from 1920, I believe. They're down to 5.2 acres. So it's definitely been a decline. They're down to about 10% of what they were at that peak. And we'll see, they're leaving this year. Right now, they're leaving the overwintering sites and heading for Texas. And of course, Texas had that incredible freeze this year. So there's concern about how they're going to do when they get to Texas, whether there's going to be milkweed to lay that first generation of eggs. The Western population here, they overwinter in up to 250, 300 sites along the coast. Again, it's that just right, not too cold, not too hot temperature zone along the ocean, keeps them cool enough to keep them in diapause, warm enough that they don't freeze. And that's where they hang out. And then in the spring, same thing, they move inland as far east as the Rocky Mountains and north up to the Canadian border, and then come back in the fall. So typically here in the Bay Area, we see them in the early spring as they're heading out, that first generation. And then we see them back in the fall when they're coming back, and the last generation is here. The way those monarchs are counted, of course, the time to count them is when they're overwintering and they're all in one place. Xerxes has been doing a Thanksgiving count since 1997. In 1997, there were 1.2 million, a little more than that, in the overwintering sites in California. But you can see these green bars, it was a fast decline there, and then it's kind of up and down at this level of about 200,000. The blue line indicates the number of sites they're monitoring. So over time, we're looking at more and more sites. There was a huge drop in for 2 years, down to about 30,000 butterflies, 27,000 in the overwintering sites. And that was of great concern because that had been decided it would probably be the tipping point for losing the migration and the monarchs. And so they did drop below that point those last 2 years. And then along came this year, 2020, dumpster fire that it's been for many of us in many ways. So here at the Posse, we were getting all sorts of calls, way more than usual. I also, in my own garden, was having really different experiences. First of all, we heard that the monarchs had left the overwintering sites 4 to 6 weeks early, which has actually been happening the last few years. We get those really warm spells in either January or February, and that has been apparently triggering them to leave. And that's a problem because the milkweed is not yet up, or it's just very tiny little nubs starting to come up. So if we don't get that first generation of eggs, it's like compounded interest. We're in trouble for the rest of the season. We also had monarchs breeding and laying eggs all summer in the Bay Area. I mentioned that we usually get a burst in the spring and then a burst in the fall, and we don't see that many during the summer, other than a few that decide to hang around. And this last summer, I know in my own garden, I started seeing eggs in June, and I had eggs laid on milkweed every single day. After that, every day I went out and there were eggs being laid. And typically, I don't get them until mid-September. So I put them in classrooms, and I'm well aware of when I have them available for teachers to put in classrooms. So that was mystifying. We started getting tons of phone calls and emails asking questions about rearing monarchs and about monarchs being in their yard. And oh, isn't it so great? There are so many monarchs in the Bay Area. At the same time, we were hearing from the Pacific Northwest that they were getting none, or very low numbers, that even spotting one in any of those states beyond California was very rare. And that continued into November, when they should have all migrated back to the overwintering sites. We continued to find eggs and caterpillars through the winter, which was also just had not happened other than to very small degree in the past. And then they went to do, and we were hearing that there were very few at the overwintering sites. They were still hanging out in people's gardens. In the midst of all this, in December, the Fish and Wildlife had been considering monarchs for a threatened status. And what the report came out, and they declared that it was warranted, but precluded by work on higher priority listing actions. In other words, they definitely deserve it. They are endangered or threatened, but there are 160 species ahead of them in line, and we have to take care of those before we can get to the monarchs. And so they're on a watch status. So because we were getting so many questions from people, and also one of my jobs is to report to the Western Monarch Advocates site the status of monarchs, and I didn't feel comfortable going with just anecdotal information. And so we put out a survey through our webpage and our email list. And we had about 140 people in and around the Bay Area respond. And basically we heard exactly what I had been seeing in my own garden and what we thought. There were eggs being consistently laid all the way through November. There was somewhat of a drop, but by November, they should have been off to the overwintering sites. People had caterpillars all through that time, and we're still seeing butterflies during that time. We also asked about the kind of milkweed around and found that it's a little better than half is native and the rest was non-native. We also asked about people rearing, because we were getting a lot of those questions. And we found out that a huge number of people had started rearing monarchs in cages or containers to protect them. We had like 3 times as many people as had been doing it in the past. I think everyone was home with COVID, the monarchs were around, and they decided this was something they could do, which I totally understand. I rear a few myself every year. It's just a magical, wonderful process. And when I totaled up the number, we ended up with that about 3,600 had been released that were reared, and about 2/3 of those had been reared indoors. So they weren't getting those end of summer cues that it was time to migrate, which was an area of concern. And then we got the Thanksgiving count from Xerxes, and it was actually absolutely devastating. We were down to a total of less than 2,000 total monarchs in the overwintering sites. Pacific Grove had none at all. It was just, and no place had more than like 50. It was just incredible. And by Christmas, when they went back to count again, it was down to almost 1,000. So we were unnerved. This was really shocking and a quick change. A lot of the national organizations suddenly were very interested in what was going and been in contact with them. Scientists are looking at it. It's just a mystery. So what's going on? It's some combination of climate change. California is warming faster than the rest of the country. We've got these warm spells I mentioned in January and February, which trigger them to leave before the native milkweed is up. And we have this continued mating activity in winter when temperatures are not to their advantage. We had a fairly warm winter this year. So they got through, or a number of them got through from what we're seeing. But all we would need is, a week of really cold, which we often get in Northern California, to really devastate those that are not on the coast. So that's a huge area of concern. It's also toxins in the environment. Xerces did a study recently where they sampled milkweed from places all over California, people's backyards, ditches in farm zones, parks, open spaces. They took a wide range, and there was not a single plant that had less than 2 detectable toxins in it. So that's a huge concern. And I mentioned the neonicotinoids earlier. This is a huge area where we need to focus. We've been talking to the city of Oakland about banning them. There are people working on it at the state level. Adding your voice to this lobby is really critical. There's some research starting to surface that this whole insect apocalypse that people have been reporting seems to very closely coordinate with the time of neonicotinoid pesticides being introduced in a particular area. So raising your voice, asking questions at nurseries, letting your legislators know that this is something that you're concerned about is really something you can do. We also know there's the prevalence of non-native milkweed. Nobody's entirely sure the total effect of that, but we do know it's increasing the OE disease in the population. And then I have been bringing up this concern based on our survey, the significant numbers that are being reared in captivity. When I first brought this up in the discussion, people were like, oh, rearing, it's not significant. It can't really be important. And then when we got the numbers and I could account for twice as many monarchs as those that were in the overwintering sites, suddenly people started to listen a little bit about that. So again, what I want to say is that if that's something you choose to do, you really need to understand the pros and cons and the things you need to do to make it safe for the butterflies. We've learned you don't want to become a super spreader event for OE. So there are a whole number of guidelines. We have them on the website. And if you're going to rear, please take a look at those. And I actually will be doing a webinar on that fairly soon as well. So keep your eyes open for that. So the other thing we need is people to contribute to citizen science. When the monarchs all went to the overwintering sites in the winter, they were very easy to account for and see what was happening because they were all there at one time. I mean, it isn't easy, but it's much more conceivable than trying to figure out where they are throughout the entire West. And so we are continuing to run a survey. We're looking for people both who are willing to report on a monthly basis what they're seeing around them. And also if they see something unusual, they're out and about, a single report. And you can find that survey on our website under the resources. You can also see the results from the survey we did last year in a little more detail. So we really appreciate that. And there's also a number of other broader citizen science projects. I'm also going to be putting a paper up about those shortly. But if you're in Northern California, we'd really appreciate you participating in our survey. And we're providing that information to scientists and the people that are doing the research because we don't have that information right now. So I want to go a little broader right now and talk about why we're concerned. We have all these issues with all these insects. And, you know, if you go back to your 4th grade biology class and the issue of food webs and food chains, insects are at the bottom. They're what feed everybody else. You've got plants and then you've got insects. So eliminating this part of the web is really very dangerous to us. I'm going to skip over this. We've talked about all of this. So as gardeners and land managers, we're still kind of stuck back in the 18th century during the period of conquest. It was all about conquering lands, conquering nature, man knows all. And that hasn't worked out very well for us at this point. We really need to change our attitude or our perspective over to being stewards of our ecosystem instead of conquerors. And we're going to talk about some ways to do that. So this is how we typically landscape. For insects and pollinators, it's a desert. And in fact, I was just reading an article last night. It's not only a desert, it's a death zone because of the pesticides and herbicides that get spread. So this is not going to take care of our ecosystem, which is based on these low levels of life. This is the gardens around Lake Merritt in Oakland, the park. This is actually the first wildlife refuge in the United States. It's 151 years old. It predates any other wildlife refuge. And look at how it's landscaped. That is hardly a habitat for anything other than human beings who want to barbecue. Tora, our famous Tora, was the supervisor of that garden for the city for a number of years. And during that time, as she became more educated about pollinators and ecosystems, she began putting in a lot of pollinator habitat around. Well, a lot of pollinator plants, a lot of host plants are weeds, which is only a plant that people have somehow decided is not acceptable, but the birds and the bugs still love it. And so she was leaving some looser, messier areas with weeds, which is what a habitat garden looks like. And she was getting a lot of complaints via email and so on. And so she put this sign together, you know, explaining what was going on. And immediately the tone changed. Same people were writing her and saying, oh my gosh, thanks for what you're doing. This is really important. So education is important. Putting signage out if you think people are going to react, very important. One of the messages we want to get across is that pollinator friendly is also beautiful. I mean, it's not that traditional 18th century formal garden kind of beautiful, but aesthetically it's lovely. And just sharing with you my own garden, this is what my house looked like when we first purchased it. It was all lawn and eucalyptus trees. It took, 2 hours every weekend to mow that lawn, which wasn't even a very nice lawn. And over time, we've transitioned it to look like this. It's a habitat garden. It's a Monarch way station. I have 27 fruit trees. It feeds us. It feeds all the creatures. I never use pesticides or herbicides. Basically, I use compost. It's all drip irrigated and low water use, less water use than the lawn was. That's an incredibly productive and busy place. So this was an early phase where we started eliminating lawn. And this is what that area looks like now in the spring. This was the back lawn. And this is what that area looks like now. So I never hear any complaints. And I live in a pretty conservative community that's really into their lawns and hedges. Nobody's done anything but compliment me on this space. So a diverse habitat garden As you can see, it has lots of levels. It has layered vegetation. It has a water source. We'll talk about that more. It has rockery and logs. It has little hiding places, places to tuck in, places for the native bees to burrow down. This is what you're looking for when you're creating a garden. You need host and nectar plants. We talked about the host plants for the various butterflies, and there are very many of those, and I will show you how to find them in a bit. You need nectar plants. We recommend 70 to 80% native. We're not rigidly native only because there are a lot of Mediterranean plants that our pollinators like just as well, and that bloom at times of the year when we don't necessarily have natives available. Year-round nectar is really critical, especially as the climate warms and these insects are active more of the year. On our website, we have this wonderful plant list that Tora put together. So it's a list of pollinator-friendly plants, but then you see the color coding there. It's coded by the color of bloom and the month that they bloom. So if you're looking to put in nectar in December, for example, that's missing in your garden, you can go in here, pick your color scheme. Do you want pink? Do you want yellow? And find a plant that will fit that. We also highly recommend the Cowscape website. And actually later on, I think Tora will demonstrate it. But I want to point out, you can put in your zip code, and you can also search by butterfly for their host plants. When you look at any plant in there, it will tell you what it hosts. Can't go wrong with oaks. They host dozens of Lepidoptera. I do want to give you just a few of our highlighted favorites tonight, and I am in the process of putting this list on our website as well. First up is Tiffonia, the Mexican sunflower. It's an annual. It's not native, although it's native to Mexico, so it depends on how you feel about borders. It grows, it gets to be about, well, I'm 5 feet tall, so it gets to be 5 feet tall each year. It grows amazingly fast. And it's an absolute, this is a swallowtail, but it is an absolute attractant for monarchs. If you have this in milkweed, you're pretty much guaranteed to get monarchs, but it's also very popular, as you can see, with other butterflies and bees. It is a busy place in the summer. Buckwheats, you cannot go wrong with buckwheats. This is the sulfur buckwheat, and you can see there's a little blue on it right now. But all the buckwheats in general are a great nectar source. This Anistontia Mallow, we have these in the garden at Lake Merritt. I have them in my garden at home. They bloom all year round. So they're just something that can, when in doubt, these guys will provide nectar for a whole host of insects. Verbena, Lilacena de la Mena, which is a perennial and a native that makes these lovely purple clumps and blooms all year round. We understand there's kind of a shortage of it. Tora's been, and I've been out doing a lot of these talks and recommending these plants. So you might have to look around to find it, but it's a great year-round nectar source. Mexican marigold, also excellent year-round. It's perennial, it's not native. The verbena is native. And I love this plant. Not only is it a great pollinator plant that has critters on it all the time, it also, I'm a dyer, a natural dyer, and it prints beautifully on fabric. Phacelia, any of the phacelias, and they're annual and native, this particular one, but there are a bunch of different ones. The bees really love phacelias in particular. Fleabane, Ridgeron, Glaucus, Wayne Roderick, again, perennial and native, can't go wrong. Everybody loves this as a nectar source. Now I'm going to add a couple, that was Tora's list. I'm going to add a couple of my own that I've found. This is Bulbine, and I have the parking strip of death in front of my house. And not only does this plant survive there, but it thrives. And all the little native bees love it, and it blooms all summer long. Salvias, Can't go wrong with salvias. These are some of the native ones over here. I also have this black and blue, which is not a native in my yard. And I mean, the hummingbirds literally come up and sip on this right next to us all the time. It's around a bench where we love to sit. Carpenter bees love it. It's a great draw. So salvias in general are a really good choice. This is a habitat garden that Tora put in at the Gardens of Lake Merritt. You can go by and see it. A couple of things I want to point out. The water feature, this seed fountain, the water just bubbles out of the top and slowly seeps down the fountain. You don't want a really active water source that's going to drown your bees or butterflies or birds. So this is just busy all the time because it's just enough flow. My fountain in my own garden is a little more active. Actually, the hummingbirds love to do a little shower in the upper part of it, but around the bottom are smooth stones where the water splashes. And so that provides a place where the bees can get their water without drowning. I also want to point out these paving stones, which were salvaged from the streets in Oakland. And they're important because they provide all these little nooks and crannies for bees and salamanders and all the little critters. I also want to point out the grasses. These native grasses are an incredible habitat and host plant for a lot of the little butterflies, the skippers. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing your garden. Now, admittedly, this is a messy garden, but that's a good thing when you're looking at habitat. It gives lots of hiding places and lots of activity. So when we're talking about habitat for native bees, remember we don't want mulch covered ground. We want to allow some undisturbed bare area for them to nest. If you're not leaving out all the dead wood and the stems and things, then providing a nest box is a good idea, but be very careful where you get it. I guess Costco's been selling some of these that are not a good habitat. So do a little research. Crown bees, we work with them a lot. They've really done the research on how deep it should be and what size the hole should be for some of the different bees. And you can actually order bees from them, mason bees and leafcutter bees. So that's a consideration. You want to leave those shrubs with the stems. You want your trees and your dead wood, if at all possible. And what you can do is just tuck it in at the back of the garden. It doesn't have to be right on the path where you walk. Just leave a wilder place if you do want a very neat garden. This is the Airbnb at the Gardens at Lake Merritt that Tora put in. In a public garden, she couldn't really leave a lot of that stuff out. So she wanted to provide habitat for them. And then there's this lovely bee garden in front. You can volunteer to help out to maintain this. It's a great place to work. And you can see all the different nesting holes in here, different sizes, and the places where they're plugged show where they're being used. I would say we wouldn't recommend building the size of bee hotel, just like we don't want to concentrate people all in one place these days. Concentrating all the bees in one place also is an opportunity to concentrate the predators, and the paper wasps in particular have found this to be a great place to go shopping for lunch. So scattered individual places throughout your garden make more sense. These are some designs of native gardens that are particular favorites of Tora's. Kate Fry is the designer, but it makes the point that you want clusters of plants. You don't want just a single plant here or there. We find that the monarchs particularly like milkweed on the edge of a plot in a clump that has lots of nectar flowers in it as well. So that's something to keep in mind when you're doing your designs. We highly recommend being a messy gardener, not deadheading everything. The things that are left on those plants, the seed pods and things, the birds love them. So not being too neat, not putting in too much time, neatening things up. let things go. Nature works on its own. So what can we do? Anything you can to help address climate change. That is the big issue of our time. Eliminate pesticides and herbicides at home and lobby to have them restricted. Support organizations doing research and mitigation. We need more information. We need habitat development. So join us, join other groups that are doing that. Provide habitat in your own garden or any garden you have access to. That includes host plants such as milkweed, year-round nectar for everyone, places to hang out, bare dirt and nesting areas, and water. It's really important. And contribute to citizen science. We need to know more, and the scientists need our eyes and ears out there feeding the information. So at the Posse, we're back to this. This is the work that we do. I want to add, donate. You can always donate to us. We are nonprofit, non-paid volunteers doing the work and getting the word out. So anything you donate will go directly into that work, into habitat or education. And I just want to end with, no matter what people tell you, words and ideas can change the world. And we're out to change the world one butterfly at a time. I'm going to end there, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Pesticides is that one is systemic and stays in the plant, like I said, for 8 years. The other one, they have to spray every 14 days. So it's more expensive for a nursery to have to use it. But we also know that we want to have the choice of what pesticides we get in our yards. And it's unfair to them to pre-spray, and they're pre-spraying without even having an infestation, which is just greed to me. That's just greedy. But the nurseries will they'll tell these conservation companies like Nurseries and everything that, well, you as a consumer won't buy a plant that has a bunch of aphids on it. So they're trying to do their part to give you a plant that you'll buy. So you, the consumer, have more power to talk to nurseries than these conservation organizations. You questioning whether they sprayed with neonics, telling them you won't buy it if they sprayed it with neonics. They need to offer you an organic version. The other thing about nurseries is the state has pheromone traps that they put in these nurseries, and they demand them, if they cross state lines, they have to spray their stock or they can't sell it. So it's really important, like Terry said, if we can get neonics banned at the state level, then it solves the bigger problem, because there is this issue, like Annie's annuals I've been working with for years, and she changed to using BT because 50% of their retail business is shipping, is mail order, and they ship all over the country, so they have to spray. So they switched to BT, which you can rinse off and cut the leaves back, and then it'll come back a healthy plant without the pesticide. But you talking to your nursery, you actually have a lot of power, and so they gave, Nurseries has it on their website, how to talk to a nursery about neonics now. And I've been working with them for a year now to get that out. But be smart consumers. So, support also the nurseries that have already gone organic. So that would be number one question. The second one is, what extent did the fires affect monarchs? Nobody really knows. There's been some research, and the research was that the smoke really didn't affect them. But I, as a wildlife person and in nature for a gazillion years working in it, I have never in my life ever saw wildlife that flew into smoke. So I do, in my heart and my instinct is to say, of course it affected them. Why would the monarchs fly into the smoke when they can fly in a different direction and not?
Tora, yeah. Well, I was just going to add, that study that came to that conclusion is pretty questionable. They looked at monarchs. First of all, it was a very small number of monarchs because they were coming from Oregon and Washington that had so few. And I mean, it was like 14 monarchs, something like that. And they looked at releasing them on smoky days there, but they didn't look at what they were flying into here. So it's much more speculation than anything that's grounded. Of the few they sent, equal numbers made it that were released on smoky days or not smoky days, but that just means they flew out of the smoke. It didn't look at what they were flying into, which is very hard to do. We don't have any tagging programs in California right now. We're in the process of getting them going because it has to be licensed by Fish and Wildlife. So we're working with the groups that are trying to get that license so we can begin to see. It used to be you counted milkweed, you counted your monarchs at Thanksgiving when they were on the overwintering sites. Now we don't know where they are or what they're doing. So we need a different way to observe.
Okay, a couple more questions. Is there a list of nurseries that do not use pesticides? I know that Xerces is working on it. When we get it completed, we will put it on our website. I know for a fact that Suncrest Nurseries is a wholesale nursery, that they don't use anything on their milkweed, because that's the trick. Even if somebody's using organic BT, you can't feed that to caterpillars and you won't have healthy caterpillars or eggs this year that you planted it, even with BT on it. So if you buy milkweed that has leaves, plant it, cut it, all the leaves back and rinse the soil. And then it'll be healthier for monarchs to lay eggs this year, but the next year it'll be fine. So I see someone that says Annie's that they don't use pesticides, but they do use pesticides. They use BT. I know that for a fact because they have to. The state demands that, or they can't sell their stock. The other one was somebody wants to reproduce the sign that I used at the Lake Merritt Garden for their front yard about pardon our weeds. I've seen a couple different versions of this now. There's the Pollinator Garden, so I think it's Palo Alto, that they have one in their yard, or they're in their plantings, their public plantings, that says, pardon our weeds, we're feeding the bees, which I think is really cute. That one that I had is pardon our weeds, this is pollinator habitat. So there's a bunch of them. I was thinking about getting them some signs made up through the posse that we can have out in people's yards, and you can print up and then laminate and put in your yard. So I work with a lot of artists because of the Autumn Lights Festival. So they're I have them in my pocket. So we'll see that on the website. So be patient with us. We're trying to get that all up. The other one about Orchards Nursery in Lafayette, I do not know that nursery. So your best bet is to go in and ask. And don't ask just a clerk or something, ask for the manager. And a lot of them don't know. You need to know the wholesale nursery they came from. And so there's also another one, Blooms in Petaluma, does not use neonics. And Xerces has been working with a lot of these nurseries, and now Lowe's has pledged to get rid of neonics, and so is Home Depot, but we're still questioning, really, did you do it? I prefer to stick to the native plant societies, their local nurseries. One of my absolute favorites is East Bay Wilds Nursery in Oakland, Oaktown Natives in Berkeley, Plowshare Nurseries, Watershed Nursery, and Suncrest, like I said. What was the other one I was thinking? Oh, Native Now Nursery up at Tilden. They're fantastic. Those are my favorite. I am not a purist. When I do landscape designs for pollinators, I actually am 70% natives at least. But as Terry showed you my go-to plant list on the slides, I have about 30% of plants that I use, especially in the Bay Area, because it's such a temperate climate and I'm trying to feed the monarchs in the winter. I use Mediterranean plants from South Africa and Australia because they're blooming in our winter. So like the Tiffonia also is from Mexico, but I always tell people that this used to be Mexico, and I'm sorry, but plants and butterflies don't have borders. It's an annual, you have to replant every year. And that is my number. If you want monarchs and you want pollinators, please plant Tiffonia. Everybody will tell you that when they put milkweed and Tiffonia in their yards, that's when they got milkweed. I mean, monarchs. I joke that monarchs can see it from space, but in my yard and some hedgerows I built last year, we were watching the hummingbirds, carpenter beetles, and monarchs fighting over the Tiffonia. I mean, it really is a huge attractant. Also, the Verbena delamina, it's a Verbena ilicifolia, which is the native verbena here. I talk so much about that plant because it blooms a little purple flower that everything loves it, bees, butterflies, and it blooms in the winter when the monarchs are in the Bay Area. It looks like there's a shortage of that plant now because I've talked so much about it. So, but Annie's, I usually get it from Annie's, and like I said, East Bay Wilds Nursery. I think he's having a sale this week. So look him up, East Bay Wilds Nursery. What about?
He's only open on Friday, so you have to plan, and sometimes on the weekend. So
right, I think he's having
a Friday field trip.
Right, he's also a great source for the pipevine. He is for propagating pipevine. He really is the guru, and he usually has a lot of pipevine plants. If you want to grow pipevine for the pipevine swallowtail. Yeah, Americia, someone brought up. Yes, Americia calflora up in the Sonoma County are excellent nurseries too. I love calflora. But a lot of the native plant and botanical gardens are, and I think Merritt College is having a plant sale in April. Those are all good resources to get, support your local nonprofits that are having plant sales instead of it being, you're more likely to get someone that's not using a pesticide because they don't have to make such a profit, the Forest Nursery Incorporated uses pesticide, would not tell me what kind. Janet, we get that a lot. There is a few nurseries that I have gone to personally and said, I really want to know what you're using because you're a main supplier for like Green Acres nurseries now. And they really shut me out. But now I know someone who works for them and they said they are committed to not using neonics. So the Green Acres nurseries, but we still doubt it. Us and Xerces is on their tail about it. Because I accused them. I'm like, you have these big displays. It says bee and butterfly gardening display and plants, but yet they had sprayed them with neonics. So they're lying to you because they're going to attract butterflies and bees to your yard, but it's going to kill them. So I think that's evil. And I told them that. So that's what we're trying to do at this level. And this is what we do. This is the kind of work that Terry and I do. I want to hit it hard at that level. So you're not buying plants that are killing the bees and butterflies in your yard. Thank you, Sheila, for being delighted to meet me and Terry. We're so excited to be working with people. No, the nurseries that I mentioned, they don't have to use neonics. The neonics is a choice they're making because it's a systemic and they only have to spray it once. We found that many wholesale tree nurseries were pre-spraying their entire stock, not even caring if they have an infestation or not. A cornflower nursery is one of the largest native plant nurseries in California. And there are a lot of the smaller nurseries broker their part. And I went to them and they said that they only use it if they get an infestation, but Xerces is on them also. So
I've noticed that systemic rose feeders don't seem to be available anymore. Do those contain neonics?
Yes, like anything stay away from systemic pesticides. I'm trying to get people to think of it like this. It's like why Roundup is bad. It's because it's broad spectrum. It kills all plants. We want to learn to target the one pest we're after. So use pheromone traps. There's lots of pheromone traps out there. Convert to that, like there's ant traps that take the poison back to the ants, but that's not going to affect the bees and the butterflies. Use the the selective pesticides, not the non-selective. Non-selective pesticides mean it's broad spectrum and will kill anything that it's aimed at, either broad spectrum herbicide, like Roundup, and then broad spectrum like Raid, and it's like, but systemic is bad because it stays in the soil and the plant for so long. And most of the neonics are created by Bayer. So if you have a Bayer rose product, don't use it. That's going to have neonics in it. Stay away from Bayer. Bayer, to me, they're the evil ones. Sorry to use that word, but it's all about greed at this point, and they really don't care about the planet. Make it the trick to not having to use pesticides is better soil. It all starts with your soil. If you have healthy soils, healthy organic compost, use seaweed a lot, seaweed, fish emulsion, and have healthier plants, are less likely to get an infestation that will, make that plant weak. So the stronger the plant, the better it can fight off the infestations by itself. And also, support local and small farmers like Rich and Side Hill Citrus that have done it the hard way. That's how we can get the message out. Be smart consumers. Buy from people doing it the hard way. Janet, yeah, thank you for letting me call evil is evil. Yeah, I agree. Please repeat the name of the nursery that has a lots of pipeline. Oh, someone did. East Bay Wilds Nursery. Okay. Any advice for getting rid of paper wasp? Yes, I've been using there's now a new trap that's for paper wasp and yellow jackets. We just put it in. Oh man, Terry, what's the name of it? I just got it at Ace Hardware.
Well, I've gotten it on Amazon too. It's a 2-part trap. And I was just there today watching the paper wasp patrol the bee hotel. I had that trap in my garden last year. I'm not sure how I got nothing in that part of the trap. So I don't know how effective it is, but it's worth a try.
Right. What I do it.
Part.
Right. I think it's hid or something. You'll see Ace carries it. You can get them on Amazon. It's aimed at paper wasps. Some people say it worked for them. Some people didn't. I say, if you I hire someone to come to my house because I have really high eaves, and he uses a least toxic and he puts it on the eaves where I've gotten, and it's when they rub up against it, it affects them on their leaves and they take it back to the nest. But if you can do it now when the queens are coming out, then you'll have less in the summer. You have to do it. It's only one time a year. Put the traps out and try to capture the queens.
I have a question. What's wrong with paper wasps? They're not aggressive and they don't bother anyone. The ground.
You haven't seen them dismember a caterpillar. They patrol. They get the eggs. They get the caterpillars. They are super aggressive against other insects, and they're new to the ecosystem. They've only been here about 30 years.
They're from Europe, and it's not that they're bad because they also eat aphids, which make me happy. But when have tipped the scales and there's more of them than the pollinators, then they become bad. So that's why I don't get rid of all of my paper wasps. I just try to keep the numbers so that we have an even ecosystem out there. And they're not native. And there's been many reports of the damage that paper wasps have done in the agriculture lands, because it's just they're getting our local pollinators have more and more and more predators, you know, and they're just overwhelmed. You know, like we up here in the hills where I am, we have the Asian, oh my God, the praying mantis that's not native here, and it eats everything. And I've watched it over and over and over eat my pipevine swallowtails. Butterflies, when they're nectaring, they hide out in nectar, and they make thousands of eggs in their egg cast, you know, their little nest. And last year I lost it because I saw one eat a baby hummingbird, and I was done. They literally can eat a baby hummingbird. So I went and collected the egg sacs and I got rid of them.
No, a lot of nurseries
I
sell
know.
to control
Makes me,
pests.
we don't need these non-native predators because we already have them because they came over with the nursery industries on the plants. Actually, if you want to do something that's beneficial, there is the parasitic wasp, which will affect your caterpillars, but they will get the aphids the best. And then ladybugs, you know, and that it doesn't affect the whole ecosystem because they're actually in our ecosystems. But really have healthy plants. That's really the trick. The plants are the key to all of this, you know, and I tell everyone here, and I'm assuming everyone on this broadcast is actually gardeners, and that you're not just a gardener or a hobbyist or a farmer or a landscaper. You're a steward of the local ecosystem. And I want you to call yourself that. And we want to thank you for being that. Thank you for gardening, but also just learning like what you're doing today. So thank you. Learning the life cycle of the creatures that we need to attract is really important. Like Terry was saying, how bees, if you're a rosarian and you have roses, the native bees use the old dead wood. Like a lot of times you'll see those old canes that have a hole on the top. And if it's plugged, there's native bee eggs in there. Don't cut that off. Leave it. And if you have to cut it off because you're an OCD gardener and you're going to lose your mind if you don't, because I do know that those people, take that cane and tie it to another like shrub and leave it, let it be. Let it be. So the native bees can come hatch out, you know, or create the little Airbnbs that like we've done in the garden, you know, because I, as a park supervisor, have to remove the dead wood and trees to make parks safe for humans. And that's why I gave back and built that bee hotel and that Airbnb, was to get, and it's mostly for outreach, for people to get the conversation. I gave lectures all up and down the state to municipality workers and gardeners and architects and everything. And nobody could tell me how many native bees are in California. They all knew honeybees, but they did not know how many native bees and how their landscaping is affecting that. Also, when you rake your leaves, a lot of pollinators wrap themselves up in a dead leaf and wait out until spring to come out. And so if you're raking your leaves and putting it in your compost bin and wheeling it out to the street, you're wiping out a whole generation of possible pollinators. So rake your leaves under your shrubs. And I always joke about people who rake their leaves and throw them away and put them in the they just like to spend money because then they run out and buy compost. You can just rake your leaves under your shrubs, sprinkle a little compost, and that's next year's compost. I mean, save yourself some money, spend it on plants instead, you know, but it's really being gentle gardeners. If you do like to keep a neat and tidy garden, keep it close to your house where you can enjoy it, but let the back of your yard be the wild zone. The less pruning, don't deadhead so much, leave the seeds for the songbirds, you know, quit over pruning. Most pollinators don't go to chrysalis on the plant that there is their host plant, where the caterpillar was. They climb away to find something that's bigger and sturdier to go to chrysalis. So when you're pruning your sage that you want to make come back really, you probably have chrysalis, because those big giant sage leaves are really good protection for chrysalis. I had a staff, we had a pineapple sage right next to milkweed in the garden, and staff wanted to cut it back, and I said, you better look for chrysalis. And one plant had 18 chrysalis on it. So if you do that, just you find a chrysalis, you can cut that piece of the stem and tie it to another plant or something. A lot of monarchs like to go underneath the rail of your fence because it protects them from wind and stuff, and it's sturdy. It's not moving too much. So look at underneath your rail next to your milkweed. Pipevine swallowtails can go up to 800 feet, the caterpillars, to find where they want to go to chrysalis. Also, they like to go where other pipevine have gone to chrysalis. My house, one side of it has a ton of chrysalis on one side of the house because they are attracted to go and find where others had gone to chrysalis. So we nicknamed our house the Chrysalis Castle when we bought it because one side had all these pipevine swallowtail chrysalis, but also know what they look like. I don't know if you remember that slide that Terry had, that a lot of the swallowtails look like dead leaves. Like you're not even going to notice that when you're pruning. So that's how over pruning, over manicuring can affect your local, your real butterfly garden. So like she said, be lazy gardens in your habitat gardener, and then you can have your OCD garden around your house. That's really the trick. Tilling is bad, digging, because you could be breaking up the native bee nests. So there's a whole theme about the wildness. Nature worked all by itself before we got involved. And so keep going to that. But also what you're doing is so, so, so important. I did want to share, Terry, can I share my screen? I wanted to show.
Try it. And yeah, you're a co-host. You should be fine.
Okay. So I want to show everyone how to use the Cowscape website, like Terry sort of showed you. So here it is live. Can everyone see that now?
Yeah, we got it.
So you go here and you put in your zip code. So I'm going to use Oakland since that's what we're used to. It will come up. These are all the native plants that are good for your area. And then you can go to one. This is the part that's kind of fairly new and that I really want to praise Cowscape for doing this. So this one, has like very low water, ground cover, sun. Here's butterfly host plants. You can click on that. So these are all the host plants for your area that's going to be hosting caterpillars for local butterflies and moths. And then you can click on that. So let's click on silver lupin. And then when you scroll down here, it tells you right here, the butterfly and the moss, that is the host plant for what it is. So it's the host plant for the blue butterfly. So it's such a cool feature now and such an easy way to find out like what you have and what you want in your yard. Because people ask us a lot about their very, very specific zone and area, and I'm not capable of making that many different plant lists for you because it's just a lot. And your microclimate is really important. And we also mentioned before too, like we're helping a garden group in Moraga build a monarch way station, but their local fire district has released a list of plants that they can't plant because of fire. And so we're trying to balance out that what you can and cannot plant for firescaping out right now. So trying to find the best plants where you get your most bang for your buck. A lot of people ask me what those plants that are the most bang, for your buck. And you can look up here, and I'm pretty sure the host plants underneath that number right there, like 31. So these are all the plants, these are all the different moths and butterflies that use ceanothus. So if you're one of those people that want the most bang for your buck, look at the number underneath the plant. Like Coast Live Oak is the one plant that even Doug Ptolemy says, if you only can plant one plant in your yard to help pollinators, oaks. I mean, look at that, 46 different Lepidoptera use oaks. This one's got 21 and 17. So you can just look at the numbers. Checker bloom, that's our local mallow for California. And it's mallows are really widely used by painted ladies and checker skippers and all kinds of things. So that's a good hair streaks. Hair streaks is the one that I was talking about, that caterpillar, when it's going to pupate, it will drop to the ground, wrap itself up in a dead leaf and wait out the winter and come out in the spring. So if you have mallows in your yard, including cheeseweed, don't rake your leaves underneath your mallows, because you're going to lose that generation you were trying to attract. So
Tora, you can also show, do you see the butterfly tab up at the top? If people are way up at the top. Yeah.
oh yeah, right there.
You can go in by specific butterflies too in your
Yeah.
area.
So that's your zip code, and here's the butterflies in that zip code.
And then you can look at what plants they need. So you can go at it that way too, if there's a particular butterfly you want. So,
the plants,
Tora,
all the plants.
yeah, so it's 6:40.
Okay.
Which is a lot of time. I did actually not record the main part of this, but I will record it and put it up on the website for people who want to refer back to it and have it or share it with other people. And you can always reach us through our website. The contact form emails directly to me, and then we decide who should respond. So that's a great way to get in touch with us. And there's always a lot of conversation on our Facebook group as well, if you are a Facebooker. So I think we appreciate you all coming today and staying through this long Zoom. Hope it was educational. If it was really valuable to you, donations are a great way to express your appreciation so that we can continue the work we do.
We're looking.
Yeah, you can also volunteer.
We have an event coming up in May called Teas for Bees. That's another one that I try to get golf courses to become critical habitat in people's communities instead of high polluters. So I created an event where we hit seed balls into the open space at golf courses with kids using golf clubs. A lot of people have been asking us for our seed ball mix. Our seed ball mix is actually specific to this event. So they're heavy clay so that they don't implode on contact with a golf club. So it's not necessarily the seed mix you're going to want for your yard. And we want to be very specific that we do this on our golf course with the golf course's, permission, but we do not want people to go using seed bombs up and down roadways and in public land and stuff, because we need plants that are specific to that site. So for you to, assume it's okay. Also, I want to point out that some people think it's fun to ride bicycles up on highways and throw the seed balls out on the side of highways, but Caltrans mostly sprays Roundup on all that. You're wasting, and we don't want the insects to be sprayed. Plus, you've all seen the grill of your car, how many insects, if they're trying to fly to host plants that are along the highways, they're going to get smashed by the vehicles. So places much more like farms, so like I said, support the farms that are putting hedgerows in. I'm going to tout Rich's horn once again, because he has spent a lot of money to plant native plants up there in Lincoln. It's a beautiful site. We want to encourage more of our local landowners to do that, ranchers and stuff, and public sites. So thank you, thank you, thank you. Don't forget you're a steward of your local ecosystem, and keep doing what you're doing and learning everything you can about your pollinators. Thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to contact us.
And thank Aki for inviting us to do this.
Yeah.
Hey, thank you.